Brick Eagle presents The Realty Debate with Manisha Natarajan, powered by Reliance Home Finance.
Hello and welcome. There's a clear and established paradox in Indian real estate. Sales have slowed down to levels not seen in 2 decades, even while there is an estimated housing shortage of about 6 crore units. Within the affordable house segment, there are 2 crore houses that are lying vacant. It's an utter and complete mismatch of demand and supply. On pricing, on location, quality and marketing, all fronts, we've just not got it right. Not just for the economically weaker segments or low income groups, but also for those just below the middle income line as well. All this needs to be fixed for the government to meet its housing for all objective by 2022. We begin our 4-part debate today on affordable housing in India, starting with the policy framework on affordable housing. And has the government done enough to meet its big objective? Joining me today are Sebastian Morris, Professor of Economics, IIM Ahmedabad, joining us straight from the Ahmedabad studio. Professor Morris, thank you very much for joining us. You've written an extensive paper critiquing the government of India's programs for affordable housing, namely the Rajiv Awas Yojana, and in the context of housing for all by 2022. We also have with us Kirti Timmanagaudar, co-founder and head of Brick Eagle Social Housing. Brick Eagle is a financial services platform for the affordable housing industry working to correct this big imbalance. Thank you so much for joining us. Shailesh Pathak, Executive Director, Bhartiya City. Shailesh is a thought leader in urbanization and infrastructure and a prolific writer and a columnist on these subjects. Shailesh, good to have you with us. Also, Professor Amitabh Kundu, visiting professor, IHT and senior fellow, Delhi Policy Group, the chairperson of the Technical Advisory Committee on Housing Startup Index at RBI and Committee to Estimate Shortage for Affordable Housing. So I really couldn't have asked for a better panel to kick off this 4-part series. Now, before I begin, there's clearly been some movement when it comes to affordable housing with this union budget. Let me set the context before I go to my panelists. Now, what did the budget really announce? It announced a 100% deduction for profits for flats up to 30 square meters in 4 metros and 60 square meters in other cities. Does this really define affordable housing is what we're going to ask. This will apply to projects approved between June 2016 to March 2019 and completed in 3 years. MAT will still apply. Service tax exempted on construction of affordable housing under any scheme of the centre or state government, including the PPP or public-private participation schemes. Now, there's also been some relief to the group I just spoke about, which is middle income and low middle income, not just EWS and LIG. Buyers will get an additional deduction for interest of 50,000 rupees per annum for loans up to 35 lakh sanctioned in 2016-17, where cost of the house, remember, does not exceed 50 lakhs. So there are certain double conditions here. Additionally, there is an excise duty exemption extended to ready-to-mix concrete, which was earlier available to concrete mix manufactured at site only. Shailesh, let me start with you. The first question, looking at what came out in the budget, whenever I go to a developer, I hear almost every developer, including the likes of DLF now, talking about affordable housing. So clearly at the policy level, and today we are looking mainly at policy framework, you think that the government is beginning to understand the issue and starting to get it right?
Yes and no. Yes, the understanding is certainly clearer. But on the other hand, the willingness of private developers to do something which is much more difficult and much less remunerative has to be evaluated in terms of what they do rather than what they say. So I can talk about what we are doing. We are creating 13,000 homes on a 100-acre area with an integrated 8,000 job factory and quality social infrastructure. So is that affordable housing? Because we are pricing our homes between 12 lakhs and 18 lakhs? Probably yes. But is that standalone 200 homes? No. So we are looking at more like a social city, if you have it, and we do not want to call it EWS and LIG. This is living with dignity at value prices.
Okay, Amitabh Kundu, so am I hearing from Shailesh Pathak that look, by defining certain parameters like 30 square meters and 60 square meters, the government seems to have confused a lot of people in terms of what really is affordable housing. Are we talking only about housing for the LIG and EWS segment, or are we talking about bringing right priced homes for masses of India and creating cities with a lot of social infrastructure?
Manisha, I agree with Shailesh that if the housing sector, the builders have the option of going for more profitable units, more profitable projects, why should they accept a less profitable project which the government is trying to bring them in? So the options are there, and even when they come into the so-called affordable housing projects which are being stipulated, there are such loopholes that it is very much easy to accept those incentives and really produce houses which are not going to the targeted section of the population. I believe that the greatest tragedy in the housing sector is that the estimated public sector investment in housing, if you take this year's budget, it is 5,400 crores, which is, if you add it up for the next 7 years, it would be less than 8% of the total money which has been estimated by KPMG or Deloitte. So basically, with 8% of public share, if you are addressing the problems of the housing sector, where 92% of the shortage is for economically weaker section and low income group, obviously the strategy is wrong somewhere. You cannot just have 8% investment coming from the public sector and hope that the housing units will be produced for the LIG and economically weaker section.
All right. Okay, so you're saying that the public sector is unable to do it and will not be able to do it. Kirti, come in here. I mean, Brick Eagle has been actually trying to correct this anomaly. The fact that every time I talk to developers, they say it is not economical for us to get into this sector. However, there is a small ecosystem of developers who are doing it profitably. I mean, your platform is one which is doing it profitably as well. So what is it which needs to come together to actually remove this anomaly and have more private sector participants come in?
Okay. First of all, as a private enterprise, we also look at profits, and I would like to believe that affordable housing offers the best risk-adjusted returns. Because of higher sales velocity, and faster construction, you can pretty much make the same IRR. Your absolute numbers may be different. Coming back to the policy itself, like Professor mentioned, most of the shortages for the EWS and LIG segment. So if you were to look at a policy framework, I would see there is a lot of SOPs on the demand side. So customers are getting subsidies. There is a new policy, right, where you get credit link subsidy up to 2.2 lakhs. A lot of our customers have received it. I know at least 50 customers, 20 in Playtor projects, 13 DBS projects who have received subsidies up to 2.2 lakhs. So that is happening. There are a lot of SOPs on demand side. On the supply side, if you look at who is producing these low income houses, it's all these small mom and pop developers who don't have access to quality capital. So, I would urge the government to set up something like a social housing fund, where they channelize the money to fund these developers who will exclusively build houses for the EWS and LIG. There has to be an angle.
Oh, that's extremely interesting. Okay, Professor Morris, you've written in your paper that there are many distortions that have made the housing, all of housing in India unnecessarily expensive, and it's also taken away much of the value to consumers. And here you have very few developers actually willing to take up affordable housing. What do you think has been wrong in our policy framework which doesn't allow private enterprise to enter into a segment which has so much pent up demand, is literally an extremely low hanging fruit to get into?
I would think that housing is unnecessarily expensive because the land use is extremely inefficient. We work in our plans with FSIs which are as low as 1, which is ridiculous. Okay, in metros elsewhere in Asia, they work with FSIs of 8, which kind of peter out to FSIs of 4. We start with FSIs of 1, 1.5, and then go on to about 1, even in the metros. So there's considerable scope for increasing the FSIs, which will create far cheaper houses and far cheaper affordable houses, both for the so-called LIG, MIG segment as well as for ordinary people, others, fairly close to city centers and therefore giving locational value. See, one of the things that happens is that the cheap housing, or let's say not very expensive housing, around 2,000, 2,500 rupees a square foot, in most cities are available very far away where the locational value is very low. Now, we have built cities which are unnecessarily very large, flattened out, and therefore there's a huge subtraction of public and social value that takes place. And so the first thing really to get going, if you really want houses, is to reduce the non-construction cost of housing, okay, and the non-locational value cost of housing. And that can come down only by increasing the FSIs. And you need to have a very major shift, maybe a tripling of FSIs in most places, with the government bidding out these and setting up a trade market for that, and that will really crowd in a lot of housing. And unless the middle class are satiated, any kind of focus by the government on affordable housing for the poor would not be used by the poor. They may possess it, but they might actually resell or re-rent it to those who can actually afford those. So, you need to come down in terms of public housing in a very big way, okay? And all that you're doing are really drops in the ocean. So if you really look at the strategy, the first thing would be to remove the massive distortions on land.
Okay. So there have been actually some state level models, Professor Kundu. Rajasthan actually did a really decent job. They doubled the permissible FAR and TDR facility, and they actually made substantial progress on affordable housing. I have UP Samajwadi Awas Yojana, where they also have done something really interesting by taking away the charges on land use conversion, and developers have welcomed that in a very big way. So within the policy framework, the question that I'm asking is that what are 3 or 4 essential things which at the state level can be done to actually encourage more participation to fill this big gap?
See, indeed, it's true that FSI levels given are very low at the moment in most of the states. So one way would be to increase the FSI and allow high density affordable units to come up. But you know what happens when you just increase the FSI? The private builders do not take the cost of infrastructure and provide adequate space for that, and our regulatory system is inadequate to address this issue. I personally feel since you talked about the policy issue, we have had housing stock growing during 90s and during 2001, 2011 at a much faster rate in the urban areas compared to the growth in the number of households. Obviously, housing shortage per se has not been an issue. There has been housing shortage for the low income and economically weaker sections of the population. You have given massive interest subsidies at the national level, and those interest subsidies have gone for construction of not middle class houses, not upper class houses. They have gone into construction of vacant houses, and that is something which is really worrying, that during the last 2 decades, our housing incentives have really created massive, vacant housing stock, as you mentioned right in the beginning.
Shailesh, why are these houses lying vacant? I mean, I also hear that affordable houses which have been built in 10 lakhs, 12 lakhs have no takers. Is it again back to square one where we are saying that they're built in locations and localities which are so far off from the city center that there are no takers for it, and that's the anomaly which needs to be fixed? I mean, within the policy framework, everyone's aware of the fact that in affordable segment as well there are vacant houses. How do you fix that?
Manisha, please. So this reminds me of the Mexican experience where low-cost homes, affordable housing was built miles away from cities, and actually 5,000 homes were built together and nobody stays there. They're ghost towns. Just going back to your earlier question, Manisha, I think it's about producing and allocating. So it's about creating housing stock and it's about allocating housing stock, and actually we should look at these two very differently. So producing housing stock, which is actually putting up houses, is always done by the private sector. in the contracting framework. So a DDA or a Karnataka Housing Board will allocate 10,000 homes to be built by a private contractor. In this, the private contractor is not taking risk either of raising money or of selling the homes, and that actually is a system that will work well. But the moment you have a private developer raising the money to build these homes and then going on to sell it, you're increasing the risk and you're increasing the effort. So unless the effort is reduced and the returns are increased, it's hard to conceive a lot of private developers. About Sebastian, Sebastian made a very important point. How do you reduce the non-construction cost of building? And while we have the Housing for All scheme, the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana 2022 and so on, the four elements of the strategy, let me just do a dive into the state government's policy. And let me say that as a private developer, what are the three things that a state government could do? And actually I'd just call it TLC, not tender loving care, but
Why not?
taxes, land and clearances. Or to make it more government friendly, LTC, land, taxes and clearances, right? So if we get cheaper land, if something like 35% of a low cost home goes back to the government in terms of taxes and stamp duties, I think it is absurd. If you really want low cost, then this 35% should be waived. Automatically you have a low cost, and the last thing is clearances.
Absolutely. In fact, I was wondering how is it that nobody is mentioning the escalating cost. Government just refuses to. It's made just profits exempted. If you're building smaller houses, affordable houses, it's trying to give you some amount of few benefits, tiny benefits here and there, but the big chunk of taxes, Kirti, aren't going anywhere. So and that's the one thing. I mean, isn't that the biggest bottleneck, that it's still really, you have to be very careful before you enter this segment, otherwise the math could go extremely wrong, and that's the reason why not too many private developers are entering here.
And while I agree with Kirti on the IRR issue, the risk perception is that we can just go awry in all our calculations should there be some delay.
Manisha, can I answer your question that you asked? Affordable housing, affordable housing does not mean building houses for those who can afford to pay the prices. You asked this question that how come even the houses which are costing 10 to 15 lakhs are remaining vacant? You must start by saying that housing shortage is, if it is for the poorer section, what is their affordability? Our national sample survey for 2013-14 shows that 83% of the total expenditure of the household below poverty line is for food and energy. Only 17% money is there for education, health and everything together. So I think you must start from there. What is the monthly paying capacity? If Deepak Parikh's committees on affordable housing says that a poor household must pay 2,000 rupees per month, at that time in 2008, I think that's an absurd kind of a figure. You have to start from who need the houses, what is their paying capacity, can the government come in with subsidies, and then can we create some limited incentives for the private sector. I am sure there will be, if there is proper institutional arrangement and there is a possibility of some amount of profit making, they should be able to come in.
Professor Kundu, there is. I mean, Brick Eagle is working in partnership with a lot of local developers, Kirti. So what I'm trying to understand is, why does it work for some developers and it doesn't work for other developers? The math, you're saying that you've got a healthy IRR and you're raising money from HNIs and then reinvesting it with local developers. Why does the math work for some and doesn't work for some?
I think Shailesh
the most important thing, although it's going to get a little deviating from the policies what we're talking about, it requires a different DNA. Affordable housing is not real estate. It's like selling white goods. You need a different marketing strategy, a different sales strategy. See, our developer DBS in Gujarat, so they have commissioned something called as Grah Pravesh. It's an NGO. So these are the guys who go and educate customers in slums and in informal housing. They handhold them. They tell them about creating a corpus for down payment and then help them create documents and then work with HFCs, get them a loan. So DBS has built about delivered about 3,500 houses, all in the range of rupees 3 to 12 lakhs.
Okay. So then let's return to policy framework, because that's the focus, and we will go back to why some people get it right, why don't. So within the policy framework, you've heard Professor Kundu, you've heard Sebastian and Shailesh. He's saying that the taxes are so heavy, the FAR norms are so stingy, that all of these things together have to actually, these are the big changes needed in the policy framework. Would you agree with that?
Yes, absolutely. The recent budget has already given tax ops for all the affordable housing projects. However, there is a catch. These projects have to be in the municipality area, and then there is no definition of the price of the house. See, just this morning I took a taxi to come to office. So this guy was telling me he makes about 30 to 40,000 rupees. If I build a 300 square feet house in Parel, will he be able to afford it? No, but let's say if I build it somewhere close in the outskirts, which are well connected by local trains from Bombay standards, say in Karjat, Shahpur, Badlapur, he'll probably be able to afford it.
But that's not in municipality area.
If it is 2 kilometers away, then it's not in municipality area. So why should government bother whether it's in municipality area or no, as long as the customer is willing to buy it and it's well connected?
Okay.
So it would be nice if they just get rid of it and then make it tax-free for any projects in India, as long as they are affordable projects.
Professor Morris, do you believe that affordable housing should be rid of every kind of tax? What's the need? I mean, there's so much pent-up demand. You're trying to actually meet a social objective with an economic objective and empower people.
Problem is with housing as a whole. So unless you solve the problem of housing, you're not going to solve the problem of affordable housing. Okay? See, actually the deficit, even in terms of affordability, let's not talk about people who can't even afford to pay what one would call a normal, mortgage or a normal EMI. So, let's keep them aside for the moment. People below the poverty line, etc. But if you take the rest, they could actually afford far more houses than actually are being built or exist. The reason why in India they can't afford houses is because Indian houses are extremely expensive. And when they are cheap, they are located in absurdly distant areas. Okay? So what one is saying is that, even for the middle class, even for the upper middle class and so on, there is massive value destruction, public and social value destruction, which happens due to the wrong locational policies, and most importantly through the so-called master plans, which are only exercises in architectural exuberance. So town planning in India is driven by architects, not by town planners, properly qualified town planning. So therefore they completely forget the linkage between layout planning and transport planning. Okay, so you have, for instance, in Delhi, you have a wonderful metro which is laid out, but the FSI around the metro is practically nothing. So people can't walk in and out of a metro as they would elsewhere in the world. I mean, if you build a metro, you might as well get the maximum social value out of it. So the point I'm trying to make is that there is absolutely no linkage between transport planning and layout planning. Now that makes the value adjusted cost of a house extraordinarily high. Okay, so you're getting a far away house which only a car owner can afford perhaps, and then you clobber up the streets.
Oh yes, okay. Along the metro, believe me, only car owners can afford any homes in NCR, Gurgaon, and even in Noida now it's beginning to be like that. Okay, I'm going to take a final view from all the panelists. If affordable housing had to be actually become a reality, Kirti, starting with you, what are the 3 things or 2 things or 1 thing that you would like within the policy framework? Just a quick reaction on that.
Okay, I will speak from the Maharashtra government because we have a few projects here. Like you mentioned, similar to Rajasthan government, if they can rezone some of the land meant for industries and some of the green zone land, it will be really helpful. See, there's a lot of vacant land in MIDC, Navi Mumbai, for example. It's not prudent anymore to build factories, just build some houses, let some of them live there and work there. So that's one thing. The second one is the taxation, which I already mentioned, just enlarge, extend it to all India. And third and most important thing is, some SPPL has started that, they're working with HUDCO to fund affordable housing developers. Right. If we can institutionalize that, then there's a lot of global impact money available, which can be brought in, because now the project becomes a government project with a lot of credibility and a seal. So now then we can get in a lot of capital into India, which is at very nominal cost. So yeah, this is
these are the things. Shailesh, you've got one thing on your wish list. I mean, you pretty much specified everything, but one thing if you'd like the government to take care of from now to the next budget.
Link all land holdings in cities to Aadhaar. That will get rid of Benami land holdings in black markets, and land prices will automatically go down.
Oh my God, that is a very, very interesting angle to it. Professor Kundu.
Manisha, I can't believe that in a serious discussion on affordable housing, you can say, okay, let's keep aside the poor and then talk about affordable housing. I mean, this looks absurd to me. I believe that 25 to 30% of the Indian urban population is still below poverty line, and 80% of the housing shortage belong to this category. The key thing is that public sector investment in housing is one of the lowest in India, even compared to the South Asian countries. There are less developed countries with the same level as India where housing is a part of fundamental right, and we are spending 7% of the government money and hope the rest of the money will come in from the private sector and the houses will be built for the poor and low income group people. This is an absurd dream.
Well, Professor Kundu, I agree with you, but I'm just thinking that, you know, with the government's priorities, that money from public sector ain't going to come. So we are all actually waiting for now the rental housing policy. Let's see whether that's going to ease up some of the problems. That's going to be another discussion, and we'll hope to have you back. Sebastian Morris, Kirti Timanagodar, Shailesh Pathak and Professor Amitabh Kundu, gentlemen, and Kirti, thank you very much for joining me today. It's just the start of a 4-part series on affordable housing, because it's a complicated issue. It's not going to get resolved in one half-an-hour debate or discussion. We'll keep this interest alive. We'll keep you thinking about how do we make Housing for All Mission 2022 a possibility. What are the solutions is what we are seeking. When we come back, we keep the debate on Tier 2 cities going. Today we'll capture some of the leading Tier 2 markets of West India, starting with Pune, Ahmedabad to Nagpur and Nashik. So don't go anywhere.